Sutra. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas, having it to see and to remember and accept. I vow to taste of the Tathagata's teaching. In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understanding of the teachings and practice offered freely as a practice of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this practice is done without the expectation of getting something in return. This is the spirit of speaking about the Dharma. Other ways to practice dana is to offer support to those who share the teachings, to support places of spiritual practice, and to give without judgment or expectation when opportunities arise. Those who share the teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis. Please support their practice if you can. And on Great Tree, there's a donate button on the website. It's currently a fundraiser to build a teacher's cabin, so appreciated. Our speaker today is Reverend Teijo Munnich, disciple and Dharma heir of Dainin Katagiri Roshi. Reverend Teijo Munnich studied with him from 1975 until his death in 1990. She received formal training at Hokyoji in Minnesota, Tassajara Zen Mountain Center in California, and Hosshinji in Obama, Japan. Reverend Munnich was ordained as a Zen priest in 1981. In 1983, she began to envision a residential practice center and community at its heart, a residential practice for women. This came to be the Great Tree Zen Women's Temple, incorporated in 2004. After an exacting search, a location was found with suitable space, and Great Tree opened in 2005 in Alexander, North Carolina.
So, good morning. So the title that I gave to this talk is "The Lotus Grows in the Mud," and that's from Thich Nhat Hanh. And several people have said to me, "Oh, that's a good title to write." And I guess that's why it struck me. This is actually, I think it's the name of a book about Thich Nhat Hanh. And I was listening to one of his lectures about this recently, and he describes that experience very well, very well. I found myself thinking as he was talking, that's a good way to explain it. So I transcribed a very short lecture by him. One thing I'm thinking about this morning is how I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and one thing that probably everyone knows about Minnesota is that it has thousands and thousands of lakes because there's so much underground water. And this morning, how many lakes are there in Minneapolis? And I came up with 8 or 9. And well, actually, there's more. I just thought of another. But there's one lake. It's actually across the street from the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. And Phoebe, can you tell me what the name is now? Because the name has changed. Did you hear me? No. She's unmuting herself. And it used to be Lake Calhoun, and Calhoun is out of grace these days. Now it's gone back to its original Native American name. Hold on a minute, I think this is not working. Can you hear me?
All right, try that.
Now can you hear me? Oh, okay. You should have been waving your arms and jumping up and down because I didn't. So I was talking about
Minneapolis. And Phoebe, I was asking you, what is Lake Calhoun now called? I can't pronounce it. Oh, she has to check. Anyway, it's a round lake across the street. Minnesota Zen Center is located on that lake. Yeah, she's coming on. Oh, can't hear you. No, still can't hear you. Anyway, it's a round lake. And I have heard that above this lake, now there's a church up there, but that Native Americans used to live above this lake. They considered it a sacred lake, or maybe it was a burial ground or something. Anyway, this lake, if you get a canoe there, you can rent canoes. You can go through a little channel and go to another lake, which has several islands. And then you can go through another channel and go to another lake. So we used to do that all the time when we were teenagers, you know. We'd be canoeing between the lakes because it's just a beautiful ride. And then one day we discovered that there was a kind of a tunnel under the bridge at the end of the third lake. So we canoed through this tunnel. It wasn't very big. And there's another lake, right? And that, not too many people, I guess people in Minneapolis know about this lake, but not too many people know about it because it's kind of hard to get to. And it's called Brownie Lake. And Brownie Lake is just a mass of lotus. And even people that know about this lake, you know, don't think much of it because it's just real muddy. And the way many Minneapolis people think is that, you know, lakes are for swimming. And if it's muddy, you know, and weedy, it's dangerous. You know, you can get pulled under. But I remember seeing that lake. I can see it in my mind right now, seeing that lake for the first time and how beautiful it was, you know. And at the same time being afraid, you know, that we weren't going to be able to canoe around in there because it was so full of lotuses. But every time I went canoeing, I always went back to that lake. And sometimes I found ways to walk down there. And I guess I could say it's my favorite lake in the city. And so I was thinking about that this morning. And I also was thinking about Plum Village. Plum Village is the place in France that was kind of started by Thich Nhat Hanh. And they have several what are called hamlets. They're living areas. And they're not all connected to each other, but they all have a lotus pond. And Thich Nhat Hanh was talking about this lotus pond, one of the lotus ponds, and he said that the people in that hamlet, it's a men's hamlet, he said the guys in that hamlet take very good care of the mud to make it just right for the lotus flowers to bloom. And I was thinking when I heard that, I was thinking how do you, I mean, I never thought about taking care of mud so that it was just right. I mean, I guess that's true of any kind of soil, but so we have a lot of mud around here right now. And also for me, our political system seems kind of muddy. And I think the scariest part about when things are murky and muddy is that we don't know what's going to happen. I was visiting one of the groups at one of the prisons in September. This was before the election, and only 3 guys showed up this time. Sometimes we'll have like 20, but they had a choice between going to Buddhist meditation or going outside. Not much of a choice, right? So only the most dedicated ones showed up. And I always like that because we have some really good conversations. And they're not just trying to get out of their cells, which is fine. As long as they sit and meditate with us, I'm good with that. But anyway, so I thought, well, we're going to have a really good conversation today because these guys have been meditating for a long time, that way before I ever showed up on their scene. And, they're very kind of spiritually inclined guys. And of course, a prison is a great place to practice spirituality because you're always challenged, So I find a lot of depth in what they say. And we were, just kind of talking about things. And then someone said the word politics. And this one guy really surprised me. He went off on how evil Kamala is, and, seeing it from a different perspective than I had seen it from. And I didn't even know how to respond. He was talking about very specific things. He's a very intelligent guy, which weren't even on my radar. Things related to prison and her as a prosecuting attorney and things. But when I left, I thought, oh, because I'm not very quick at responses, but I thought, how would I respond to that? And then I thought, well, what I want to say is, you have been in prison for 20 years. So this is your life. But for me to live under a very violent system of thinking is a very scary thing. I sometimes think about the Civil War. And I think, what was it like during the Civil War? People knew, they must have known what was happening, but you never knew if somebody was just, if a regiment was going to come and just burn your house or take care of, you've probably heard these stories. And that's the way I was feeling, And so when this election happened in the way that it did, it was like the bottom fell out for me. And I woke up in the morning and I was kind of numb. And I thought, how arrogant I am to think that I can just, that life is the way I want it to be. I'm very happy here. I like my life. And it suddenly occurred to me that, this is real reality. Real reality is we don't know what's going to happen. And we just have to kind of navigate whatever we're within. And Thich Nhat Hanh, is a very interesting example of someone who really grew very deep spiritual understanding by being in a country that was under siege, in Vietnam. And he started a peace village asking for peace. And he told us, but both sides were threatened. Both sides were threatened by peace. And so Sister Chan Khan, who was his first disciple, one night I was at a retreat and she started telling us a story. And she's a really good storyteller. And it went on for like an hour or so, but I'm just going to condense it. She said, one day in the peace village, some soldiers came. And the custom in Thich Nhat Hanh's practice or community is to greet people when they come, invite them for a cup of tea. But these guys came into the Peace Village and they all kind of went out and they were sitting kind of lined up. And suddenly this one soldier started to shoot. And he shot her best friend who was standing next to her and killed her. And she was really angry. And, but there was this part of her that, recognized that anger as something that was not beneficial to anyone. And so she started to do walking meditation. And she said she did walking meditation all night. And just at dawn, after doing walking meditation all night long, she remembered something. And what she remembered is that right before this soldier shot her friend, he said, he was a young guy. He said, I really don't want to do this. And when she said that, because I'd been feeling the anger with her when she was talking about it. But suddenly, there's something inside of me just broke open, and my heart just went out to this soldier, and that's exactly what happened to her too. Suddenly she wasn't angry anymore. Her anger just went away. I think this is a time when we really have to reflect on ourselves and what is the source of conflict. When I was at Tassajara, Thich Nhat Hanh came and he did a peace conference while he was there, and somebody asked the question, how do you bring about peace? He said, first you have to become peace. You have to become peaceful. And I had been kind of not wanting to meet Thich Nhat Hanh. He came there just to teach us. I didn't know he was going to come. But in Minnesota, there was someone who was very gung-ho about, the peace movement, which is fine, but she was also very pushy, and it became a very kind of, I don't know, political thing, And I don't like to bring political conversations into spirituality, although I'm doing it right now. But sometimes I feel like it creates more conflict than it does real spiritual growth. So I don't like to kind of think with my head in that way. But so I had a lot of issues with how pushy she was being. And so and then she was, we got to invite Thich Nhat Hanh and all this, I was like, So anyway, he came here. I went to Tassajara and he came, and I was very affected by his presence. He was a very quiet person, like my teacher, Katagiri Roshi. And when I heard this, I was like, yes, that's how to bring about peace. And at that point, I started to see how wars got started. Because even bringing about peace in myself is difficult. I could see how conflict comes up and how we want to stand our ground in my way or the highway kind of thing, and how do we meet? Reverend Kilke Roberts used to teach, well, first she taught, I wanted her to teach mediation at Zen Center of Asheville. So she did that. And then it turned into conflict resolution. And then people didn't like the idea of conflict resolution. So it turned into compassionate communication. So, every year we had these, and her main point was that we all create realities for ourselves. This is kind of basic Buddhist teaching, that we create an idea of what is real, what is reality. And it's based on, how we're taught, how our parents think, how our friends influenced us, the various things in our life that we kind of sort out and put into a system of thinking, and we describe that as reality. So if someone doesn't think in the same way we do, then there's a conflict. But in this conflict resolution, the way she used to teach it, well, she was a professional mediator. So she came from the perspective of mediation. And she said, she was talking about listening to each other, right? And she said, if you're in disagreement with someone, first one person should keep probing and saying, why is that important to you? Why is that important to you? Until you understand what's behind the fear that is driving. It's always a fear of losing something, losing our own understanding of how things should be, or what will happen if it doesn't, if it goes a different way. And she said, and we would find, well, first one person would do it and the other person would repeat back. You've probably had that kind of experience. And then you switch over and the other person, you try to understand. And she used to always say, don't come up with solutions. Don't try to come up with solutions. The solutions will come up on their own. And what happened when you had these kind of conversations, and she gave us little stories that really didn't even have anything to do with our lives, and you take a role, but you'd really identify that role somehow, and but what you would find is underlying these conflicts or fears on both sides. Fear of some kind of loss or something. And as soon as you got in touch with those fears, immediately there was a connection, because we all understand that. We all understand what it's like to be firm in a position or wanting something to be a certain way, because we're afraid of losing something, or afraid that something will turn out in a way that will be harmful to us. Ultimately, we're afraid of death, I think, because it's a kind of death when our perception of reality gets shattered. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about suffering in this one talk that I was listening to, and he says, suffering and happiness are not enemies. They are. Suffering is made of happiness, and happiness is made of suffering. If there is no suffering, there is no happiness. And if there is no happiness, there is no suffering. It's like the lotus flower and mud. If there is no mud, you cannot grow a lotus. And the lotus stays there for some time and becomes the mud again. So looking into the lotus, you see the mud. And looking into the mud, you see future lotuses. Suffering is a lot like that. Someone who has a capacity to go back to himself or herself and listen to his own suffering and look deeply into his suffering, he will be able to understand that suffering, that suffering inside of him, that carries with it the suffering of his father, his mother, his ancestors. And getting in touch with suffering inside helps you to understand your own suffering. And understanding suffering gives rise to compassion. Has anybody ever done Tonglen? Tonglen it's a Tibetan Buddhist practice of, basically it's breathing in something which is negative, something that annoys you, something which you're upset about, some kind of conflict, breathing in your whole body, kind of embodying that, and breathing out something that would kind of, I always say the antidote, something that would be the balance for that. And when you do Tonglen, it's suggested that you come up with a word to describe what you're breathing in. So my favorite example of it is we used to do it when I was teaching a class on Buddhism at a local college. We used to do it for a week. I wanted the students to be able to experience different kinds of meditation. And so for 1 week we did Tonglen. And one day we were watching a film about a conversation between Pema Chodron, who is a Tibetan teacher, and Alice Walker, who is a kind of a student of Pema Chodron, and Alice Walker is a writer, as some of you have probably read her stuff. And Alice Walker was very interested in Tonglen. So this video was about Tonglen. It was a conversation between them. And I was sitting next to one of my students who really annoyed me. She was raised as a Buddhist, and she kept telling me how much more about Buddhism she knew than I did. So that I found that really annoying, you know, and she sat next to me, and I thought, oh man, I don't want to sit next to her. And then I looked up at the screen and I thought, perfect opportunity to do tongue. So I started breathing, and I was trying to find the right word. And the word I came up with was arrogance, that she was very arrogant. But as soon as I breathed it into my body, I immediately recognized my own arrogance, you know, because we really can't judge someone unless we know that experience ourselves. I mean, we all kind of know that. And it just dissolved for me, because I thought, when I saw my own arrogance, you know, it really, you know, I understand what's behind arrogance, you know. And so what was the word I came up with to kind of, you know, the antidote? I can't remember what it was. Oh, I know. Fearlessness. Because I realized that arrogance is based on some kind of fear. You know, in my case, it was probably fear of being challenged about something that I was the teacher of, right? You know, sometimes when you get put into that role, you kind of start to kind of puff yourself up and think that's what you really are, you know. But she had plenty to teach me, and as is always true. But how that, you know, he says it's the basis of compassion. Suffering is the basis of compassion, or, you know, waking up to this is painful. You know, it's painful to see these things about ourselves. But when we actually have that experience, it dissolves all the judgment, you know, and that is really the basis of compassion. Compassion isn't, oh, I'm feeling sorry for you kind of thing. It's really touching that experience of the other person's suffering. And if we don't touch our own suffering, we can't make that connection. So, you know, one of the things I'm always saying is that I can't hate President Trump because he's just like my dad. And I loved my dad. There's something about him that's just like my dad. So there's this part of me that, even though I don't understand the way he thinks, there's something that touches me about him as a person, you know. And I'm grateful for that, because I don't like to hate people. And so where do we go from there, you know? I was talking the other night about this, because this is what's on my mind. I talk about what's on my mind, you know, at the Zen Center. And I was, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, the whole question of being able to have a conversation with someone who believes so differently. You know, it's so difficult for me to know how to navigate that. And yet, that's what we have to do. This is a great opportunity for us to really, all of us, to really learn how to talk to each other, whichever side we're on. You know, to be able to be in that neutral place that can listen to both sides. This is the only way that we're going to be able to bring about peace in ourselves and peace in others. And so those conflicts that we experience, I think, and those difficulties, we have to know that somehow we have to face them very squarely. You know, I frequently, when I run into a situation of conflict, and it's not just our political situation, but also in my personal life, you know, where I know I'm in conflict with someone else about something that I just don't want to talk about it. I just want to kind of stay away from that person. And Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this in part of this. He said, suppose you look at someone, even though that someone has made you suffer a lot during the past many years, and you don't want to look at him or her, because every time you look at him or her, you suffer. Possibly you believe that that person has made you suffer so much. But now with the practice, you become different because you have already understood your own suffering. This is what happens when we're on the cushion. You don't just sit down in pieces just there. First, you have to look at all your crap. But now with the practice, you become different, he says, because you have already understood your own suffering. This is why you are capable of recognizing the suffering in him, in her. And you understand why such a person suffers so much. And that person suffers so much and does not know how to handle the suffering. That is why his suffering is spilling all over, around, and you are a victim. Maybe he did not want to make you suffer. He does not know how to handle the suffering. That is why he continues to suffer. And because he suffers, you have to suffer. You are the second victim, and he is the first victim of his suffering. So having understood your own suffering, you have compassion, you have insight, and you suffer less. And that allows you to look at the other person, and when you can see the suffering in her or him, and you understand why that person suffers like that, you are no longer angry at him anymore. And this is the proof. If you look at someone and you can see the suffering in that someone, that he is not capable of handling that suffering, you don't blame him anymore. You are not angry at him anymore. Instead, you want to do something, to say something, in order for him to suffer less. Means that you have compassion in your heart. And compassion in your heart does not make you suffer anymore. Ram Dass said once, this is considered his apocalypse quote, although he doesn't use the word apocalypse. He said, I have been asked many times whether this is the Aquarian age and it's all just beginning, or if it's Armageddon and this is the end. And I have to admit, I don't know. Whichever way it goes, my work is the same. My work is to quiet my mind and open my heart and relieve suffering wherever I find it. So that's all I have to say. But if you have anything you want to say, please share.
I was kind of interested in what you were saying about not confusing compassion with like pity, I guess.
Mhm.
And I guess I have a hard time I have a hard time understanding it, how to respond compassionately, because I feel like with people that I don't share, political backgrounds with or similar experiences with, I think I'm feeling compassion, but it's actually pity. And for people who, I have more natural sympathy for or whatever, my compassion is sort of just like suffering and like dread and, more like absorbing their suffering rather than trying to heal their suffering. And I guess I have a hard time distinguishing, sort of picking the compassion out of those feelings.
Mhm. And I think, we can't really relieve someone else's suffering, but I think that by learning how to look at ourselves deeply and recognizing ourselves in that other person, in a sense, recognizing our own suffering, first of all, and then I mean, I don't know that there's anything that we can do. In fact, I think that our inclination to do something is something we need to look at. But recognize that something has to be done. Like the hurricane is a good example. There was this great impulse for everyone to do something, and even the smallest little thing, you could just see it in everyone. And yet it also occurred to me that that was going to kind of wane. And here we are, the media is gone, and a lot of the help from outside is turning elsewhere. And yet there are still people that are living in tents up in Boone, and it's snowing, So, I think that, to not burn ourselves out trying to overlay a way of this is what we have to do. It's impossible to know, but when something needs to be done, it's right there. So do we turn away from that and try to do something that sort of gives us a feel good? Or do we look at that and say, I don't know what to do. It's a big thing, but I want to do something, and then we take one step, toward it. Even with just our awareness, we take one step forward. And then when the moment comes, we don't miss it because our eyes are open, But I think this inclination to do something, we have to kind of take that into our hearts rather than giving ourselves the feel good, like, yeah, I did this or I helped this. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? And I just think it requires a lot of reflection, and I feel so grateful for the time that I spent on the cushion in monasteries, because it took away all of my ability to escape. You're in a community, you have to follow the schedule. You have to, when it's time to meditate, you have to meditate. You don't have anything to, I mean, there were those times when I planned my escape, but it's very hard, especially when you're sitting in a monastery in rural Japan and you've brought way too much stuff with you to think about how you're going to escape in the middle of the night and get all your stuff out. And, you don't really know the culture. And at a certain point, you just keep sitting on the cushion and you say, oh, I get it. This is my ego. This is my arrogance, And it's a good thing to see that. Because if we don't see it, we can't open our minds to all the possibilities. But if we see our connection, if we can see our connection with other people and not try to fix something, which is really hard to not try to fix things, but just allow life to unfold. I came to the conclusion in trying to start Great Tree because, as you've heard me talk about, things fell apart, came together. It was a real roller coaster. And there were many times where I wanted to say, oh, this is not working, where what do? Do you stop and walk away and kind of say later when you're laying on your deathbed, maybe I should have tried a little harder, maybe I should have, or do you just put one foot in front of the other and walk into your feeling of failure? When we try to fix something, we have an idea of what it means to be fixing it. But what are the possibilities now in this situation? What does this moment have to teach us? I mean, I've been saying for the last 4 years, why don't those Republicans reach across the aisle? Okay, now it's our turn, I can't even talk to most of my relatives about politics, Either they're too far this way or too far this way. What's the middle way? It takes a lot of reflection. And this is where this practice really, really helps us. I don't know if that responded to what you were bringing up, but I've been very politically involved for the first part of my life. First in very, liberal Minnesota politics, and then even further into more radical politics, demonstrations and I feel like that somehow I don't know, somehow there needs to be the ability to make a conversation. And one of the things that I recognized very early on in my meditation practice was that neither of those things that I was involved in were really working, and that somehow I needed to look more deeply. And meditation practice sort of helped me see that. And it's a struggle.
I really liked what you brought up about the becoming piece, and I think that's a great reminder. And I find just sort of the meta practice of loving kindness for others, even in my own mind, see how that transitions into like real time when you're standing with someone and you're able to notice the reactivity in yourself. And I find the loving kindness meditations and like the Tonglen practice super helpful because of the visualizations, so that when I'm feeling triggered, I notice that, and I can't fix anything, but I certainly can try to maybe model the piece or for my own self. And then I think seems like one of the big steps to show that it's possible, even in times of crisis or conflict.
And whenever we do these things, I think we have to do them, whatever your spiritual practice is, whether it's Tonglen, whether it's just sitting in meditation, whatever, or prayer or whatever, we have to do it regularly so that we stay in that awareness. Because as you were talking, I was thinking how Tonglen works and loving kindness works, but you have to remember to do it. And it's the remembering, remembering in that moment. And so having a regular Tonglen practice, for example, I think Pema Chodron talks about, when somebody asked me one time, I was in a grocery store and I saw someone abusing their child. And I know that it might have just accelerated it if I tried to do something about it. So I all I could do was Tonglen. And I thought, wow, to be able to do that on the spot, it can put you into a reflective state to the point where your compassion can help the situation. Maybe the right response will come up. I've had a hard time. I have a very good friend that used to be my roommate, who is, she thinks just very different from me politically. And So when she brought up politics one time, it just polarized. It's changed our whole relationship, you know? And like I said, you know, my cousins and my in-laws and I mean, there's a lot of people in my life that I haven't been able to talk to. As long as we don't talk about politics, we're okay. But my cousins were visiting this summer, and we were having just a wonderful time. We have a very warm relationship. I don't know them too well because they grew up across the country from me, but one of them said to me, he said, you know, I'm a Trump supporter. And he said it in such a mild-mannered way, and we were having such a good time that I just very easily said, oh, you know, I don't really support Trump myself, but I don't hate him because he reminds me of my dad. And that was the end of our conversation. But I felt so good about that because we didn't walk away with any kind of angst about it. And I thought, progress. You know, I'm actually able to have this very brief conversation with somebody that I completely disagree with politically, and we don't come out of it with this bad feeling. So maybe that's all we can do, you know? I don't know.
I saw something on the news one time when I was in the doctor's office, and there's this thing called Better Angels, and it's like a national. I don't know if it's like a good organizer. I don't know much about it, but it seemed kind of cool. It's like it gets together like kind of left and right wing people to just like talk to each other and like have coffee together, like in different communities. And it was like a lot of like younger people and older people. It seemed like older, more conservative people and younger, more liberal people. That was what it seemed like, but probably there's different ages. But it seemed really cool because I think like forming like a real relationship with someone who thinks
Mhm.
really differently than you helps you both to see the humanity in other people who don't believe the same as you, and maybe it will help like add up to something if a lot of people can do that.
Yeah, and I think that something like the hurricane really brings us together in a certain way. You know, I mean, all my neighbors are think different politically than I do, and yet, you know, when the hurricane happened, they brought us water because they had a generator, you know, and we have wells here, so we have water, you know, and you know, all of that just, and when I'd lose my dog, and my dog she had vertigo, so she could go down the hill and she couldn't get back up. So my neighbors were always kind of finding her for me. And that, you know, brought us together in another way, you know. And so, I mean, I think that's an important thing to consider. And, you know, look at how communities are working across religious and political boundaries to help each other because of the hurricane, you know. It's nobody's talking politics. Well, I'm not going to say nobody because there are some people that are bringing it, making it into a political thing, but in general, you know, nobody's asking, a lot of people are not asking that question, you know. Like, I won't bring you water because, you know, you think different than me. You know, and we're Buddhists in a very Christian neighborhood too. That's the other thing, you know. Sorry, this is what's on my mind these days. So I want to read you this poem too by Larry Ward. This is a whole different perspective of fear, a level of fear, because Larry Ward is he's a teacher in the lineage of Thich Nhat Hanh, and he's an African American. And I know from having Chimio live here, Chimio is African American, and she's someone that was ordained by me, and she lived here for 10 years. And I really saw a different perspective on on elections while she was here, and on a lot of things. So Larry read this poem at our Poetry and Pie the other night, and the name of it is As I Awoke. As my eyes opened this morning, I knew who had won the election and why. If you wanted to build an all-white nation, you should not have brought me here to work the fields of cotton and tobacco, break my back laying railroad track, fix your meals, raise your children, and tolerate and transcend your cruelty and my tears. Our shared trauma is profound. I now see the vastness of its field, so troubled the waters. There is difficulty transcending it. Know that you can, because it has already transcended you and flowed into the valleys of history. If you look and see with the eyes of truth, there were not hordes of non-whites coming for you. Rather, it was your fellow white citizens coming for you. Truly in apocalypse times. The four horsemen ride famine, war, conquest, and death without reproach. Fueled by racism, psychic social rage, a white nation swan song made by fear and suffering. The illusion of otherness, is tattered but remains intact. Ram Dass says, whichever way it goes, my work is the same. My work is to quiet my mind and open my heart and relieve suffering wherever I find it. Any other thoughts? Oh, it's 10:57, so